Sherlock Holmes and the Caribbean Pirate. The New Adventures, Episode 7, by William K. Stewart and F. E. Patzak. Based on characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Narrated by Mark Young. A few days after our excursion to Kew Gardens, which was eclipsed by a rather bizarre murder, Holmes and I were sitting at the breakfast table on Baker Street, discussing our next leisurely activity. "I understand, my dear Watson," Holmes began, "that you're entitled to another attempt at an excursion after our stroll through the Royal Botanic Gardens got slightly out of hand." "Out of hand?" I repeated disparagingly. "No, Holmes. Would our excursion have been at sea instead of on land, then our boat would have crashed straight into the cliffs of criminology." Holmes passed me an almost fatherly smile. "Let's agree on sank to the bottom of the sea," he countered. "But that's in the past. We shall hoist the sails and set off on a new adventure. It's for your well-being, after all. What about a walk through the zoo, for instance?" I hesitated before agreeing. "I don't know," I answered slowly. "You have a gift for finding dead bodies, perhaps even in guinea pig enclosures." Before Holmes could justify why the zoo would be a good idea, there was a knock at the door, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, entered the room. "Pardon the interruption, gentlemen," she said, "but a certain Mr. Blackbeard would like to speak to you." "Blackbeard?" I asked, amused. "Is this fellow a pirate?" Mrs. Hudson coughed. "I believe," she answered hesitantly, glancing over her shoulder, "I believe that may be accurate." Holmes looked up, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "A pirate?" he repeated. "Please let him in at once." As Mrs. Hudson was making her way to the ground floor, I passed Holmes a firm, questioning glance, to which he simply said, "I've always wanted to meet a real pirate, haven't you?" I shook my head emphatically and stated, "Holmes, it may disappoint you to hear that there are no more pirates." Mrs. Hudson appeared on the doorway with our guest, an elderly man with a greying beard and an eye patch surrounded by scars. He tipped his old-fashioned feathered tricorn, exposing a red bandana, then bowed and limped towards us, as if he had a peg leg in his left boot. Apparently, this was a pirate, after all. Holmes tossed me a triumphant glance, and offered our guest a seat, while Mrs. Hudson was shutting the door behind her, discreetly as ever. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the pirate began, "thank you for seeing me. I am here to request your services." The words, "for a sea raid," regretfully slipped my lips. Holmes glared at me, punishingly, but the pirate burst out in laughter. "Don't worry, young lad," he assured. "Those days are long gone. Please excuse my appearance, as I am operating incognito. My name isn't technically Blackbeard, it's Morgan Montgomery." As he was speaking, he took off his eye patch to reveal a second, entirely unharmed eye. While Holmes appeared a trifle disappointed, I, on the other hand, felt vindicated, and asked somewhat conceitedly, "So you're not actually a pirate after all?" Our guest again broke out in laughter. "My dear lad," he said, upon regaining his composure, "I am captain of the Thunderbolt from Port Royal, the fastest sailboat in the Caribbean. Of course I'm a pirate." I was now utterly confused, and unsure whether we were being fooled, and if so, why. Holmes, for one, was back to his old self, and acknowledged Montgomery's statement with a brief, "Naturally." "Well then," I began, "if you're a Jamaican pirate, Mr. Montgomery—" "Captain," he interrupted. I couldn't quite follow. "Excuse me?" I asked. "It's Captain Montgomery," the pirate instructed in a serious tone. I sighed audibly. "Oh, pardon me, Captain Montgomery," I corrected myself. "If you're the captain of a pirate ship, then I have two questions. Firstly, didn't the golden age of piracy end over 150 years ago? And secondly, according to my knowledge, Port Royal has sunken into the ocean in the year 1692, following an earthquake and tidal wave, which is why Kingston Harbour was erected in its stead. Don't tell me you're also a time traveller." I made Montgomery laugh a third time. Then he suddenly turned serious. He whispered to me in confidence, "My young friend, time travel is no laughing matter. It can be very dangerous." At least now I knew we were dealing with a madman. Montgomery continued, "Concerning your other question, here's one for you. if you were planning a pirate's lair, would you situate it on the island's largest trade port and the Royal Navy's Caribbean base, such as Kingston, or near a decrepit, largely abandoned port-turned-fishing village, such as Port Royal? This was, admittedly, a perfectly reasonable explanation I had not considered. Still, I did not want to let this likely charlatan off the hook so easily.
"So, Captain Montgomery," I began anew, "you'd like to convince us that you're a marauder?"
Montgomery sprang to his feet. "Do not insult me," he cried, as he reached for his sabre, which, luckily, he did not have on him. "I am no marauder. What nerve!" Holmes felt the need to intervene. "Let's keep calm," he said. "Dr. Watson surely didn't intend to insult you. Perhaps you would like to explain what precisely it is you do, and what you don't." The captain hesitated for a moment, then sat back down, pulled a flask out of his jacket pocket, and took a generous sip. "Cuban rum from Havana," he explained, and offered us the flask. "Would you like to try? It's exquisite stuff." We thanked him, but declined. Montgomery, after having regained his composure, began to relate his story. "It's true, I come from the ruins and wooden shacks of Port Royal. I began sailing out to sea as a little boy. My parents died when I was still young, and I quickly became an excellent navigator and deck officer. That's why my crew appointed me captain."
"Your pirate crew?"
I asked. "That's right," Montgomery offered. "It was the summer of 1861, during the first months of the American Civil War. The Thunderbolt was a privateer contracted by the Confederates to relieve the Yankee merchant ships of their loads, without inflicting personal injuries whenever possible. Of course, we were men of honor."
"So, sea robbing after all?"
I exclaimed with a raised finger, but Montgomery would not be provoked again. "By no means," he answered calmly. "We were privateers, with a letter of marque from the Confederate government, and, by the way, with the unofficial support from Her Majesty the Queen's government. It was, in fact, a rather deplorable British foreign policy to have played an active role on the side of the slaveholders in the maritime conflict of the American Civil War, enabling and encouraging privateer raids from British territories. I do not want to seem unpatriotic, but the Empire was rightly sentenced to pay reparations to the United States. For us, it was all business," Montgomery continued, "and not at all dishonorable. On the contrary, in a way we were following in the footsteps of Sir Francis Drake, and it was a good business. In only 3 years we were able to amass a small fortune. I, in particular, since, as captain, I stood to collect double the bounty than the others. But it was all over in the fall of 1864. You were right, Dr. Watson. The age of piracy had come to an end. We could no longer compete with steamers, propellers, armor plating, and modern artillery. Our boarding tactics became obsolete. Once the hunters, we now became the prey. The Thunderbolt was sunk by the USS Dictator in November of 1864.
"In other words," I concluded, "your career as a pirate ended more than 18 years ago."
"That's right," Montgomery confirmed. "Inevitably. Most of my crew, my officers in particular, could escape the sinking ship, but I wasn't so lucky. The U.S. Navy scooped me out of the ocean. After the war, I was sentenced to 80 years in prison for piracy, first at Fort Jefferson, and then on Alcatraz. But 6 months ago, I was able to escape." Montgomery was clearly serving up another fairy tale.
"You mean to tell us," I asked in disbelief, "that you escaped a prison island?"
The captain took another sip of rum. "That's right," he explained. "It took several years to dig through the prison sandstone walls with a spoon. I scaled the outer solid rock rampart with a rope made from tied-up handkerchiefs that I collected over the years and swam across the bay to the mainland."
"That's a nearly 1.5-mile swim," I cried. "Excuse me, Captain, but at your age, I find that to be utterly impossible."
Montgomery's deep laugh could be heard anew. "Does it comfort you to know," he inquired, "that a dolphin came to my rescue when I was near drowning?" He did not pause for me to voice my next objection, and continued his story. "I then travelled across the country by train, as a stowaway, from San Francisco to Boston, where I was hired under a false name
as a navigator on an English merchant ship. And now I'm here."
Holmes listened patiently while pacing up and down the room. He returned to the table and sat down.
"What an exciting and semi-tragic story," he began.
"But I don't understand, Captain Montgomery.
What do you need our help for?" "Simply put," the pirate explained, "something was stolen from me while I was in prison, and I want it back."
Holmes furrowed his brow. I could not resist a tease.
"Oh dear, did they dig up the hidden treasure you so diligently buried on that secret monkey island in the Bermuda Triangle?"
Montgomery did not bat an eye.
"Precisely. That's right," he said, and took a sip of rum before continuing. "As modern privateers, we don't bury our money, but keep it in a safety deposit box at the Barclays Bank on Lombard Street, here in London. But the box is empty. It must have been emptied while I was gone by those who have access, including my lion's share."
To my exasperation, Holmes slowly began to show more interest in his case.
"I see," he said. "And who are those you suspect of having stole your riches?"
"My former officers," Montgomery answered. "In the meantime, they have established civilian lives here in London with my money. These dishonourable men have breached the pirates' code without hesitation or remorse. That is punishable by death," he said, as he jumped out of his chair and raised his fist.
"That seems a bit harsh to me," Holmes remarked, trying to calm our guest. "You don't intend to enforce the code yourself, do you?"
Montgomery appeared to be calming down. He sat back down and once again drank from his flask as a precautionary measure.
"By no means," he assured. "I just want my money."
He then pulled a piece of paper out of his jacket pocket and handed it to Holmes.
"These are the names and addresses of the two thieves. David Jones, my former helmsman, and John Smith, my boatswain."
Holmes glanced at the paper, while I looked over his shoulder.
"David Jones and John Smith," I repeated. "Are you being serious? Are these two gentlemen also incognito?"
Montgomery did not understand my question.
"What do you mean?"
he asked.
"Those are their names, always have been."
I was about to speak when Holmes interrupted.
"Very well, we have their addresses. But, Captain, I'm still not sure how we can help you." "You must understand," Montgomery explained. "I can't go to Scotland Yard with this. Of course, I could pay Jones and Smith a visit myself, but I think that the two would be more likely to return my treasure if a famous detective, such as Sherlock Holmes, asked them to." "You want us to be your messenger boys?" I protested.
Holmes gestured me to show restraint.
"My dear Watson, although this presents as an unconventional request, the case as a whole has the potential to become a rather diverting challenge, given the appropriate compensation, of course."
Montgomery nodded.
"Goes without saying," he confirmed. "Naturally, I can only provide payment upon successful completion of the job."
I didn't have a good feeling about it, and I still had my doubts about the captain's soundness of mind, but Holmes agreed.
"We will take on the case," he declared, almost celebratorily.
Montgomery stood up from his chair and reached out his hand to Holmes.
"Thank you for helping a poor old seaman seek justice. You will not regret it." He then handed us another piece of paper. "I've put myself up in this hotel by the docks. Contact me when you're through."
He adjusted his eye patch, turned round and walked out the door, now limping again. We couldn't have known that this would be the last time we set eyes on Captain Montgomery. After he left, Holmes turned to me and asked,
"What do you think, Watson?"
I took a deep breath as my mind was brimming with thoughts.
"Well, Holmes, first off, I'm not sure whether Montgomery is making fools of us. His story is quite adventurous, perhaps a bit preposterous."
Holmes nodded.
"Indeed. He appears to be in the habit of embellishing his stories, but perhaps he's just spinning yarns. I believe, however, that there is some truth to his tale, and I reckon we should look into it."
"Still," I countered,
"if Montgomery's accounts are based in reality, and especially then, we must question the legitimacy of his demands. His alleged fortune stems from piracy, after all."
I believe this to be a valid point, but Holmes once again surprised me.
"Don't be so pedantic, Watson," he replied. "Montgomery was a state-sponsored privateer. The financial loss to the shipping lines were covered by insurance policies. The Empire itself paid the United States reparation payments, and the Southern states did not get away scot-free either. And let's not forget that Captain Montgomery was imprisoned for nearly 18 years. That should be penalty enough, don't you think?" "But he was convicted to 80 years, I added.
"Quite right," Holmes said dispassionately. "But that only proves two things. Firstly, that the American criminal justice system imposes ridiculously harsh penalties that are difficult to take seriously. And secondly, that this is a case of victor's justice, regardless of one's personal sympathies in the Civil War. If the Confederates would have won, they wouldn't have imprisoned Montgomery and pinned a medal on him. No one stands to profit from sentencing Montgomery to poverty in his twilight years. Besides, Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones have clearly broken the law." I instinctively furrowed my brow.
"What law?"
I wanted to know. "The Pirates' Code," Holmes stated, as if it would be a matter of fact.
"Don't take this the wrong way, Holmes," I argued, "but I doubt that this code holds any legal validity in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland."
Holmes smiled impishly. "No, it doesn't," he replied. "But we're talking about a conflict between fellow pirates, former shipmates, who swore on the code, irrespective of any sovereign rights, laws, and jurisdictions. We must thus be faithful to our client and his legal framework." It was clearly my time to capitulate. Holmes had firmly decided to take the matter into his own hands.
"All right, Holmes," I sighed. "What shall we do now?"
Holmes did not have to think long, for he had already planned our first steps. "We will first investigate the two gentlemen named by the captain. Where do they come from? What are their backgrounds? What are their careers? We must gauge whom we are dealing with before confronting them with Montgomery's story." With the help of our discreet sources in the police and administration, we soon found out more about David Jones and John Smith, and were somewhat astounded by what we learned. Mr. Smith was an elected member of the British Parliament, a position he has held since 1874. A party man and backbencher of the Tories, Smith represented the dubious constituency of Dunwich. The general consensus was that he had bought his seat. Mr. Jones was a successful neurologist and department head at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital in Suffolk, a psychiatric clinic with a questionable history, but there were no official records pertaining to the locations or activities of the two men before 1870. The research results solidified Holmes's determination. "Very interesting, my dear Watson," he muttered. "A member of the House of Commons, and a colleague of yours."
"I beg your pardon," I protested. "You've clearly never visited one of these institutions. Our psychiatric clinics are sinister relics of the Dark Ages. I've seen similar clinics in Paris, Zurich, Leipzig, and Vienna that treat patients conscientiously and progressively. Here in England, psychiatry is still in its infancy. We deem the infirm mad, lock them away, shackle them in chains, keep them in a perpetual state of sedation. We even operate on them against their wills, turning their brains into mush. They are at best guinea pigs. I would like to firmly distance myself from this disgraceful chapter of English medicine."
Holmes did not expect me to react so impassionedly. "I see," he said. "So you're saying that our psychiatric institutions resemble prisons for those deemed incurable?"
"That's right," I confirmed. "If Mr. Jones practices in a madhouse of this sort, then I must seriously question his medical integrity. It is unfortunate that our society still considers these recognized practices."
Holmes paced up and down the room. "That makes sense," he finally said. "Using their fortunes, Jones and Smith left their lives as pirates to establish new ones here in England, presumably with the help of fake documents and bribes to get ahead in their careers and enter into London's upper crust, gaining access to the aristocracy, the educated elite, and political leaders. I must say, these gentlemen have done rather well for themselves."
"Presuming," I objected, "Montgomery is telling the truth."
"I have little doubt about that," Holmes explained. "And one thing is for certain,
A visit from their Caribbean past is the last thing that the benevolent Dr. Jones and the Honourable Mr. Smith expect. So what will we do now? I asked. Holmes broke out in a smile full of joyful anticipation. We will pay them a visit. The address we were given led us to John Smith's office in Westminster. It was located on the first floor of a stately building, in sight of the Palace of Westminster, the seat of the British Parliament. A posh and not exactly cheap location. We knocked, and to our surprise, Mr. Smith himself opened the door to his office. He seemed mildly surprised to see us. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" he asked in a less than friendly tone. "Good day," I began. "My name is John Watson, and this is Mr. Sherlock—" "I know who you are," Smith interrupted promptly. "I read the newspapers regularly. After all, I'm also quite certain that the two of you don't reside in my electoral district. You must, therefore, be here on official business. And concerning these, I can assure you, I have nothing to do with it, and have an airtight alibi." While I did not yet know what to make of Smith's performance, Holmes seemed a trifle amused by his preemptive explanation. "Wonderful, Mr. Smith," Holmes replied. "It's always good when one knows to defend oneself from any accusations. Only, we've not accused you of any wrongdoing." "Not yet," Smith snapped back. Holmes remained calm and polite. "In fact, we just want to confirm or disprove the veracity of an alleged incident," he explained. "Would you be so kind as to assist us in this? May we enter?" "No," Smith replied brusquely. "I was just about to make my way to Parliament. Now, if you would please excuse me." He grabbed his coat and hat from a coat rack next to his door, stepped outside, and locked his office. The three of us now stood in the hallway. "We certainly don't want to keep you," Holmes reassured. "Would you permit us to accompany you a short distance?" Smith put on his coat and made his way towards the exit. "You're of course free to go wherever you like," he said as he was walking down the stairs, "and I am privileged to only engage in conversations that interest me." "Naturally," Holmes said, as we followed the parliamentarian. When we got outside, Smith put on his top hat, stopped, and turned to face us. "Gentlemen, I am, as you can imagine, a very busy man, so ask your questions if you must, but make it quick. What is this about, anyway?" As requested, Holmes got straight to the point. "The incident in question occurred several years ago. Are you familiar with a certain Mr. Montgomery?" Smith stopped to ponder demonstratively. "Montgomery?" he repeated. "I'm sorry, that name does not recall anything. Who is he?" "According to him," Holmes explained, "Mr. Montgomery is a former colleague of yours from a joint venture during the early 1860s. Smith again struck a thinking pose, and again to no avail. "I don't know what you're talking about. I spent those years in New England, chiefly at Harvard University in Massachusetts. What kind of venture is this Mr. Montgomery fantasizing about?" "Piracy," I explained concisely. Smith began to laugh out loud. "Piracy?" he repeated. "What splendid humour, Dr. Watson." Holmes put an abrupt end to the parliamentarian's cheer. "That was not meant as a joke, Mr. Smith. According to Captain Montgomery, you were his boatswain on the Thunderbolt, a Confederate privateer, during the Civil War. And after this venture," I added, "you robbed him of his share, at least according to Montgomery, and he would like it back." Smith had heard enough. His face turned sour as he spoke. "Gentlemen, this is an egregious accusation, malicious slander, and I find it scandalous, Mr. Holmes, that you wish to risk your good reputation on this nonsense. Don't forget, I'm a powerful man. A detective's career can end at a moment's notice." I was now convinced that Smith had something to hide, for one does not utter such threats without reason. "The same goes for a politician's career," Holmes countered, "especially if it's built on lies and crimes. Even parliamentary immunity can't save you when the house of cards comes crashing down." Smith's grin was so sly it could have come from a pirate. "Gentlemen," he said, "it appears we have nothing more to say to each other. The truth is that I don't know this Morgan Montgomery, so I couldn't have stolen from him. But he is entitled to bring this matter to court, if he so chooses. That's all I can tell you. Good day, gentlemen." And he walked away hastily. Holmes and I took a coach to Southwark to visit David Jones at the mental hospital. On the ride, we both agreed that there was little doubt the Honourable Parliamentarian Smith had some dirt on his hands. "Irrespective of poor manners," I said, "his dismissive attitude towards our investigation indicates that something may not be quite in order." Holmes nodded. "There's no doubt about it," he confirmed. "He displayed a defensive attitude, even before he knew the purpose of our visit. I presume the theft of Mr. Montgomery's share is not the only offence Smith has been party to, but we must put that aside for now. And I'm sure," he added, "that an inquiry at Harvard University would result in no records of him ever having attended. A falsified law degree, however, would count among the lesser offences committed by Mr. Smith, especially compared to professional piracy." Holmes smiled. "My dear Watson," he asked, "are you finally admitting that Captain Montgomery may be telling the truth?" I had to think about it. "I wouldn't take him at his every word, but in broad terms his story seems accurate. Besides, Smith gave himself away. He does indeed know Montgomery." "Oh?" Holmes remarked, astounded. "You noticed it too?" "Of course I did," I answered confidently, trying to hide my growing sense of self-satisfaction. David Jones welcomed us into his consultation room at the mental hospital, where we were feigning to seek his expert advice. "I am very pleased to make your acquaintance," Mr. Holmes Jones began. "I've heard so much about you, it would be an even greater pleasure to actually help you solve a case." Holmes nodded. "I'm sure you will," he replied. "We hope your professional expertise will provide us with some more insight into a rather complicated matter." "I'm entirely at your service," Jones assured, with a smile. I, meanwhile, had to hide my resentment for the kind of psychopathology he practices and represents. "Well now," Holmes began, "we are dealing with an elderly gentleman with a questionable mental disposition. In short, he thinks he's a pirate." Jones narrowed his eyes. "A pirate, you say?" he repeated. "That's novel. We house an Admiral Nelson, a Captain Cook, and 2 Christopher Columbuses, but neither buccaneers nor corsairs. Does the man claim to be any specific pirate or historical personage? Perhaps Bartholomew Roberts or Edward Teach?" "I don't believe so," Holmes replied. "Or a fictional literary character? I just recently picked up a new and very popular book by a Scotsman by the name of Stevenson, Treasure Island. The protagonist is called Long John Silver." "Regretfully, no," I refuted. "Our pirate's name is—" "Most common," Holmes interjected. "As common as Smith or Jones." I recognized what Holmes was doing and decided to remain silent. Jones did not seem bothered and simply said, "I see. What else can you tell me about the case?" "My dear colleague," I began, "our patient dresses like a pirate, talks like a pirate, and behaves like one too. It seems as if he's serious about it." "Of course he is," Jones explained. "A personality disorder that's severe is usually firmly rooted in the patient's brain. Any grasp on reality is lost, usually permanently, and the inner delusion conflicts with the patient's surrounding reality, which is why we often observe violent behavior. If that is the case, the only help is a surgical procedure in the frontal lobes of the brain. This way, the patient is at least guaranteed a peaceful existence." I, of course, knew that precisely these kinds of operations, which do more harm than they do good, turn the patients into mental cripples, unable of any conscious expressions, as if stuck in a perpetual vegetative state. This sort of therapy was considered state-of-the-art by our nerve doctors. "He has not displayed any violent behavior so far," I determined confidently. "I presume," Jones continued, "that your patient told you a watertight story to underpin his delusion?" "Indeed," Holmes explained, "a quite adventurous tale about privateering in the Gulf of Mexico and the east coast of the United States. According to our pirate, his ship sunk during a naval battle with a superior ironclad, and he was imprisoned for a couple of years. before managing to escape to England, from where he now seeks revenge on his former shipmates. I carefully observed Jones' reaction, but could not discern one. "He seeks revenge?" he asked. "Quite right," Holmes confirmed with a smile. "But the story isn't over. It gets better. Our pirate claims to have been robbed of a treasure by his helmsman and boatswain, and naturally he wants it back." Jones finally showed some hesitation. "Your pirate?" he asked. "Was he the captain of the ship?" Yes, Holmes responded, "in his delusion, naturally." "And in his delusion," Jones stuttered, "did the ship have a name?" Holmes pretended to think about it. "I don't remember it clearly. I think it was something to do with lightning or thunder." "Thunderbolt," I interjected. "Ah, yes, thank you, Watson," said Holmes. "Thunderbolt. Very good. That's the name. A bizarre story, isn't it, Dr. Jones?" Jones stood frozen behind his desk, showing no emotions. "Dr. Jones," Holmes repeated. He finally unfroze. "I had to think for a moment," he explained. "I do not wish to come up with a hasty diagnosis for your case." Holmes nodded. "Of course not," he said, feigning faith in Jones. Jones walked towards us from behind his desk and took off his glasses in a gesture of frankness. "If you ask me, gentlemen," he began, "it would be best to commit the pirate captain into a closed institution, such as this one, for his own safety and the safety of all. Somebody with an identity disorder and a violence-prone personality will lose control sooner or later and strike. People could get hurt." "I see," said Holmes. "We will take that into consideration. Ultimately," Jones explained as he turned to me, "his physician will have to make the decision." "You have helped us a lot, Dr. Jones," I thanked him sincerely. "We will be in touch again." We left the building, crossed the street, stepped into a coach and waited. "I believe, my dear Watson," Holmes opined, "that we put the fear of God into poor Dr. Jones. He will soon supply us with the last piece of evidence we need to verify Montgomery's story." I did not let the gate of the clinic out of my sight. "If we are correct," I mused, "then Jones and Smith know each other from their time as fellow pirates, and Jones will soon show up to see Smith to discuss their next moves regarding Montgomery." There was silence, while Holmes was stuffing his pipe. The sound of crackling gravel directed our attention to a coach leaving the clinic grounds. Jones sat alone in the passenger seat. Holmes knocked the coach box through the side window and ordered, "Follow the carriage, but do so discreetly." We started to move and trailed Jones at a safe distance. His coach headed north towards the River Thames and crossed the London Bridge into town. There it headed westward and, as expected, arrived at Westminster, where it stopped in front of Smith's office building. Jones alighted and entered the building while his carriage waited at the curb. We waited in the coach for a good 10 minutes before I stepped out and Holmes rode on to our arranged meeting place. I kept surveilling the building for another 10 minutes, then decided to climb the stairs to Smith's office. I knocked at the door. It took a moment for it to open, and when it did, I stood opposite the parliamentarian. He did not look very pleased to see me. "You again?" he snorted. "I thought we had already discussed everything." I stuck my foot out before he could shut the door and cried, "I'm here without Holmes's knowledge. I want to help." Smith hesitated, but decided to let me in. Dr. Jones, who we had just met in the consultation room, was visibly shaking. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand to calm his nerves. "Do you have any rum?" I inquired when Smith offered me a drink. "Regrettably, no," Smith answered. "It's not to my taste. But let's get to the point, Dr. Watson." "Well, now, gentlemen," I began, "Mr. Holmes and I are diametrically opposed about the case at hand. To my regret, he believes Montgomery's story, and has decided to help him seek justice in this matter. I have an altogether different perspective." Smith's ears pricked up while Jones poured himself another whiskey. "It is my professional opinion," I continued, "that Montgomery is an erratic, insane man. At our first meeting, he attempted to assault me with a sabre. He clearly represents a danger to society. It is my duty, as a physician, to do no harm. and to prevent harm being done to others. I believe Mr. Montgomery poses an imminent threat, and should spend his remaining days in secure custody of a closed-off clinic."
"My thoughts precisely," Jones cried, and raised his glass. "Cheers!"
"Would you please stop drinking so much?" Smith ordered with a harsh tone. "I believe we still have important work to do today." "I know where Montgomery is," I explained. "We can go to his hotel immediately and transfer him to the clinic on my doctor's orders. My esteemed colleague Dr. Jones can make the necessary decisions and preparations for his further course of treatment."
"Thank you, Dr. Watson," Jones said, instantly sober again. "An operation of the brain will be imperative for poor Mr. Montgomery to finally come to peace." A half an hour later, it was dark by then, the hospital's coach came to a stop in front of the Mermaid Hotel. Smith, Jones, and I entered the hotel, asked the receptionist for Mr. Blackbeard's room number, and ascended the stairs to the first floor. Door number 7 was unlocked. I pushed it open carefully, and was the first to enter. The room was dark, and I could only see faint silhouettes. There seemed to be a bed with a person sleeping on it, against the right wall. "All right," Jones whispered. "We'll tie the straitjacket around his body and gag him." Smith unexpectedly pushed his way to the front and cried, "Never mind that," as he pulled a revolver out of his pocket and pointed it at the bed. In that instant, an oil lamp flared up near the wall. Opposite the bed, illuminating a person holding a pistol, it was Holmes. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. "I've been expecting you." Jones and Smith were so paralyzed with shock that Smith did not resist when I took his revolver away from him.
"You won't need this any more,"
I said, and pointed it at the two.
"What's all this about?" Jones asked. "Dr. Watson, we're colleagues after all."
"We aren't colleagues," I refuted. "You are a disgrace to medicine. I doubt you even hold a genuine medical degree."
"And you, Honourable Member of Parliament," said Holmes as he approached, "were in the process of attempting murder. All you would have shot, however, would have been 2 pillows under a blanket." Smith still seemed confused.
"But where is Montgomery?" he asked.
Holmes shrugged. "I have no idea," he answered. "In some other hotel, I presume."
"You don't have a chance," Smith cried. "No court in the world will convict me."
Holmes smiled confidently. "I am quite convinced," he explained, "that we won't need a judge. In fact, I am even harboring the hope that the two of you will start cooperating with us, now that Montgomery's story about your joint privateering venture has been adequately substantiated."
"You even gave yourself away at our first meeting,"
I interjected triumphantly. Smith took a moment to think, then asked, "What do you want?" "Just Montgomery's share," Holmes answered. "That's all. Isn't that a point of honour among pirates?" Smith and Jones agreed to deposit the proper amount of cash in a locker and send us the key. If they failed to do so, we would publish their written and signed confessions about privateering. Upon payment, we would, naturally, destroy these documents. But to our surprise, it wouldn't come to either scenario. The next morning, we were at the breakfast table. A courier brought us a letter from Captain Montgomery that included generous compensation for our work. The letter stated that Montgomery had told the truth, but used us from the start, for which he apologizes profusely. In fact, he had trailed us the whole time, waiting for us to lure out his former shipmates from their hiding places. While we set up a trap for them in the hotel, he had broken into their apartments and stolen cash, gold coins, jewels, and cashable bonds. He threw all bank statements that had their names on them into the River Thames, so these could not be cashed. Smith and Jones were now largely penniless. Montgomery also took all papers that could document their true past. Soon, newspapers across England would report that the Honourable Member of Parliament, John Smith, was really a blacksmith from Kentucky, and that the reputable neurologist, David Jones, was in fact a butcher from South Carolina. Naturally, the two would subsequently lose their positions and face court proceedings on account of forgery, violations of trade laws, wrongful gains, bribery, and, in the case of Jones, severe personal injury. According to Montgomery, there would be no mention of piracy, for the Pirates' Code explicitly prohibits betrayal among former comrades. The letter ended with the words, "Please excuse my hasty departure, but my transatlantic ship set sail at daybreak. Besides, I still have a lot to do. I would like to replace the wooden huts of my hometown with brick buildings, buy the fishermen new boats and nets, get medicine, construct a school building, and rebuild the church. The fortune I amassed through piracy and theft will serve as a good foundation for achieving these goals. As for me, I do not strive for much except to have a roof over my head and the mercy of God." I finished reading Montgomery's letter aloud. As I passed it to Holmes, I remarked, "He's the best pirate I've ever heard of." Holmes smiled. "Don't be so quick to glorify him as a modern-day Robin Hood," he warned. "Once a pirate, always a pirate." He folded the letter, dropped it inside of an ashtray, and lit it with a match. "What are you doing?" I cried as the paper was slowly being consumed by fire. "In the next 4 hours," Holmes explained, "the police will knock at our door and ask about the whereabouts of a certain Caribbean pirate." "And what shall we tell them?" I asked. "The truth," Holmes answered, "that there are no more pirates in the Caribbean."